just start by rolling out a very small MVP, making sure that you have the basics covered, and let the metrics work for you and tell you if it makes sense to invest more into that market.
Hello and welcome to the Multilingual Content Podcast, where experts discuss international content management, translation, and global communication. I'm Caterina from Undertow, and today let's dive into the basics of starting a SaaS localization program. Our special guest, Julio Leal, is an expert with almost 20 years of experience in SaaS localization. Currently, he is the head of localization at Spendesk. His insight have played a crucial role in changing how different companies approach their localization strategy. So, without further ado, let's dive in.
Hi, Julio. Thanks so much for joining us today, for accepting our invitation to the Multilingual Content Podcast. How are you today?
Hey, Nicola, thank you so much for having me here and the invitation to be part of your podcast.
So today we're going to talk about a very, let's say, complex topic on how to start a localization program within a SaaS startup. It's quite an extensive topic. I know we'll try to touch as crucial insights as possible. And you have a plenty of experience with this. So I will start actually from you telling a little bit to our audience about your background, your experience in the industry, and specifically about how to start a localization program.
Okay, sure. Well, I've been involved in localization and translation all my career. Since day one, I started as a translator, working as an in-house resource within a translation company, and I gradually became a project manager. After that, I moved to the buyer side of the industry, starting to run translation and localization programs on companies. And in time, I basically specialized in setting up and creating localization programs and setting up teams from scratch. That's what I enjoy the most. And basically, that's where we will focus our conversation today. I'm so excited to share all my knowledge here today with you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, you have a lot of knowledge about the topic. That's why it was amazing that you accepted our invitation. And I wanted to start from the very, very basic, the initial steps to assess the need for a localization program within a SaaS startup. Where would you think, would you look first to have a look whether or not it's time to enter into a market and where to start, basically?
Well, obviously, if you join a company because that company thought that they needed a localization manager or a translation manager, that's a very good sign that the company is already aware of the need of that role and that there is a need for a more specialized role for that topic within the company. So obviously, that's a very good sign. I've seen very mature companies with a lot of employees not realizing about this when they are too much into the localization course and they are kind of late to the process. And I've also seen, surprisingly, this is happening more and more, where companies realize very early in the stage that they need to incorporate a localization professional in the company. So that obviously helps things a lot because you can create a very solid foundation of the program and you can help the program mature very naturally instead of trying to go very fast and anticipate things very rapidly when you incorporate that role very late in the process. When assessing the need for a localization program, especially within the software as a service environment, there are quite a few crucial steps for determining the need for a localization program. One is the market research and analysis. Basically, it's understanding where your customers are. You need to identify the regions where your product has the potential for high demand. And you can actually look at this by analyzing your current user analytics, if you have them, and identifying the 16 international usage. Obviously, all this data will help you prioritizing where you should focus your efforts first. obviously, another topic, another area is the competitor analysis. Obviously, you are probably not alone in the market, so you need to actually examine how your competitors are handling localization. This will help you get some insights into the market expectation and standards, and also potentially see where are the undeserved languages and regions. Another way of assessing the need for this is actually, which what actually I think happened in my current case right now at Spendesk, is kind of a natural um, growth of the company, going to markets in which you kind of feel more familiar, just because the markets are very similar. The target audience is very similar. There is not a huge effort for adapting the content and the product. So obviously, it's kind of a low risk movement for the company, like, going from France into Spain or going from France into Germany. These are very common markets, and obviously the risk is very low. Another way of knowing and assessing the need is obviously assessing the customer feedback and demand, right? Your customer support, your field marketers, they understand the market better than anyone else in the company. So obviously, in the interactions they have with the customers, they will appreciate and they will understand if there is a need for localizing the product into more languages at that point. When there is a growing demand and the conversations are becoming more frequent, obviously, there might be a time to analyze if localizing the product into that language and into that market makes them more sense. And my recommendation is that you always kind of start with a pilot project, meaning that, hey, we are not 100% sure if we should go into that market or that market. Just start by rolling out a very small MVP, making sure that you have the basics covered, and let the metrics work for you and tell you if it makes sense to invest more into that market, or if maybe that market is not ready yet and you need to wait until it gets more mature, or if you need to prepare your product more for that market. So this would be, under my point of view, the main consideration when assessing the need for a localization program in a company.
But that's actually very good, especially I like the looking at competitors, what they're doing, and figuring out there might be untapped markets. Because sometimes otherwise we run the risk with this of figuring out what markets to enter. It's like a egg and chicken dilemma, because if you look just the current data of your users, you might not have users in those markets because those markets are very, let's say, they don't speak English at all. If your app, let's say, is in English, so they're not using it because of that, and it's very difficult for you to catch like that, but to tap that potential market. So that's really interesting.
Yeah,
and I love the concept of, as you said, an MVP. What we actually like to do is like we started figuring out the what we call an MVE, so a minimum viable experience. So looking at the whole customer experience, looking at the very bare minimum, let's say, of an experience that you can offer your users. So you make sure that you launch in those markets, not going all in, which might be too expensive. And as you said, then you realize maybe there was not the potential that you expected. And you start with a bare minimum, test it out, see how it goes, and then build on top of that in the markets that actually get some traction. That's absolutely crucial.
totally. Yeah. I mean, you nail it. In the sense that obviously by creating this small minimum product or experience, you mitigate the risk. You say, hey, this is what we can lose, but actually we invest this money in this product, this is how much we can make. So obviously there is a high potential of success for that market. So
yeah, we call it experience because we don't look just at product, we look at the whole experience in the sense like how you get the first awareness, like we look at every step of the customer journey. So the awareness phase throughout to the onboarding, reaching, let's say, the first milestone, let's say they have to go through to make sure that you have acquisition, and then you up to referral, renewal, depending on the kind of. So this kind of, so you get the minimum there, because otherwise the risk, you might have somebody dropping down like at some points of the customer journey because they're served up to a point. So let's say they start using the app because it's localized, and they go to the support your help center and everything is in English, and they hit a speed bump. They try to get in touch with the customer service. They don't speak the language, and then you might have a churn rate that is higher than it could be. Well, yeah.
Yeah.
So, but that's, yeah. And one of the things that, like you mentioned, you already touched on that, the target market, the target languages to start localizing on. What I'm also interested in, like knowing what kind of tools, like what key consideration would you have when you select localization tools and technology. So like going for if you will need a dedicated platform for where you are doing managing translations, maybe to automate and integrate some system. Is there like some advice you will give to somebody starting to move the first steps into localization?
Yeah. So obviously in a startup environment, and you watch every cent and every penny that you are spending. So my first advice would be looking at the integration landscape. Obviously, bringing a translation management system, which would be the core of the whole technology around your program, you need to be working with other teams. Localization is usually at the center of all these processes. You need to work with product, marketing, etc. So eventually, you know that you're going to be working with those teams and their tools. So obviously, you want to make sure that whatever TMS you bring on the table, it's fully integrated with this, right? So you call it Figma or Notion, right? So you don't want to create a big disruption. So to me, that would be one of the main key factors, making sure that there is a huge array of integrations for that TMS. Second would be probably scalability. So again, as a startup, things might go very fast. You need to always look long term. So hey, will this TMS solve our needs now, but also in the foreseeable future? We are now doing 5 languages, and we are working with product and marketing, but maybe in 2 years we have twice as much languages, and we are working corporate-wide with legal, with e-learning, etc. So you need to make sure that TMS is able to incorporate all these new demands, and there is no added cost or significant added cost to it. Third, and this is very personal, I try to engage with support during my conversations with those technology providers, because obviously on paper and in the early conversations, everything works fine. There is no downtime. Everything works smooth. But when you actually see the company working at its best is when you have problems, right? So when you open tickets, you want to engage with the customer support to see how fast they react, because more often than not, all these tickets will not be urgent. But when you are in real need of solving problems, when things are going south and you need to solve problems immediately, you are expecting the customer support to be having very immediate responses to your problems. So to me, that's critical, right? So on paper, it might be one thing, but you need to make sure that you engage with support early in your conversations to see what are the response times, if you will have a dedicated person, etc. And last but not least, as I said earlier, and it's kind of in connection with the scalability, is the support for the diverse content types, right? So yeah, you may have a TMS that works perfectly okay with product and for marketing, but what happens when we incorporate new teams? Will they also be able to work with, I don't know, subtitle files, or will they also be working with e-learning? So these are all, some of the key things that you need to consider when bringing in new technology. And last but not least, and to me this is also very critical, is the quality assurance features, especially in the early stages when your bandwidth is very limited and your resources are also very limited. It's good that your TMS incorporate as many QA features as possible to automate that process and make sure that you are measuring quality right from the start, and that you have very metrics that you can incorporate from day one to make sure how your quality is evolving and where you need to take action, etc. So I think that might be my key 4 or 5 points when implementing technology into the program.
And so just to sum it up, a lot of it is like the first part is connected with what we talked previously, is like communicating with different departments and stakeholders within the company to make sure that even somebody that doesn't need something today might need it tomorrow. So you're prepared for that as well, and you don't get a surprise. And a question I have on this is, would you consider, would you like having more than one, let's say, platform or main piece of software? Because you mentioned, for example, subtitles. It's not always like it's very different, obviously, from software strings or marketing content. Why would you think about that? Like, if it's possible to keep it separate, or there will be some limitation, but maybe you don't do as many videos, so it's okay. You can kind of live with that.
Yeah, good question. I don't think there is a right or wrong answer for that. Just because, back to what you were saying, just because you have one subtitle request for your team once a month doesn't mean that you have to incorporate one tool for that, right? Maybe you can outsource that to the agency. It's about the volume and the associated cost. So obviously, if there is a growing demand for this content type and your current TMS is not supporting that type, maybe it might be worth exploring what other options you may have out there and see if it pays off to incorporate a new additional tool into your ecosystem. I have worked both ways, having one single TMS managing all my content types, but I have also tried an environment in which I manage multiple TMSs depending on my stakeholders, my content types, etc. So I guess there is no one size fits all. It depends on volumes, how the company manages vendors, etc. So ultimately, you want your team to be flexible and be able to incorporate new content as fast as possible. Obviously, if you have teams knocking on your door requesting for help, they're not going to be waiting 1 month, 2 months until you figure out how you're going to solve the problem. They will probably need that immediately. So you need to react quickly. So you need kind of to have that plan B always ready for whenever all these new content types are waiting for you.
In some way, yeah, it's like being involved. And before that, what I wanted to discuss a little bit, if you can give some insight or recommendation on when you're starting out to make sure that you have you can make a case for building a localization program, putting together a localization program. So how can you secure buy-in from the different stakeholders? Because some people might say, well, I mean, maybe it's not needed, maybe we're not going to need it, and then they come back later on actually needing it. So what would be your recommendation on how to get their buy-in from the very start?
Yeah, good question. Obviously, you will need buy-in and support from your stakeholders in order to be successful running the localization program. To me, it would all start with a clear presentation of the market opportunities that the localization program would open up. And that would include potential on new users or customers in target markets, the market size, and the potential growth rates in those markets. I would also highlight in that presentation how competitors are performing in these markets and how localization can give a competitive edge for the company, both for competitors already deploying localization exercises, but also for competitors which have not already started that localization effort in certain markets. That presentation will be presented to stakeholders who want to see numbers, right? So I would make sure to provide a detailed forecast of the return on investment. So basically, that would include projections of increased revenue from entering new markets, how our user base would be expanded, and how we would improve our customer retention rate, right? And I would then compare these benefits against the cost of localization, right? Including translation services or, I don't know, bringing new staff in or all the costs around the technology. Last but not least, I would also make sure to incorporate in those conversations success stories, right? I would look at competitors that went down the localization road before us, and I would prove how localization helped these companies grow in those markets, become more robust, create more market customer retention and customer satisfaction. So it would be a question of proving how we can become a revenue enabler for the company, and at the same time present success stories of companies that have been there before and that are showing us the way to do things. Maybe we will not do things exactly the same way. We will do our things our way. But obviously, if other companies see it in those markets, there is no reason to question that we should not also be successful.
I really love it because you switch a lot of times, like localization translation is seen as a cost center and you're turning it around as an investment. So absolutely agree on that. And I'm curious to understand a little bit more about when you say, by looking at the potential of in the different markets, how do you relate those numbers, since are they projections based on your domestic market? Or do you look at competitors? How do you come up with those projections?
Yeah, it would be a mix of both. And I can give you a personal experience example. So before we move into new markets, we already knew that we had users in those markets. Basically, they were using non-localized versions of our market, of our product. So obviously, those early adopters of your product, even when it's not localized, are a clear sign that there might be a very good product fit in that market, right? So it's very critical that, and that's actually something that you need to be working very exhaustively in year one, which actually was my last year. It's basically measuring and keeping track of everything. So you create the baseline for, hey, this is how things are now, and this is how things are improving or going the way when we implemented the localization program. So obviously we cannot associate all the success of growth in certain markets to localization, but obviously there is a clear correlation between market growth and localization effort, right? So there is a clear sign, and the numbers show that the more you invest until a certain point in a market, in terms of localization, there is exponential growth for your product. So those projections are based both in your home market. You see what is the actual growth or sustainable growth rate in your market, but also what is the target addressable market in that specific locale, right? So the home market may have a wider target audience than in the next product, but that can give you a sense of, this is how much we could grow next year based on our projections in similar countries, in similar years for certain, right? So I think that would be a mix of both.
So just to understand a little bit better, so you will look at the total addressable market that you have, like your, let's say, domestic market, and then you look at different international markets, the total addressable market there, and correlate the share of that market that you currently have in domestic with the
Exactly.
the trend that you followed in the domestic market, and try to correlate that with the potential that you could replicate, let's say, this trend in that market, obviously with different numbers. So if you have like a 1 million user in the domestic market and half of it in one of the international market, it will be half of the, let's say, same results. But is this kind of correlation?
It's a kind of correlation, but when you are projecting those numbers, it's very important that you have also separate conversations with other stakeholders that are part of that effort. So obviously, and this is also based on personal experience, if in your home market, let's say you have 10 people exclusively working on sales, creating new opportunities, and in the new market, you just have half of it, you cannot expect the same growth projection just because the effort that the company is putting on those new markets is not the same. So it's not fair to say, okay, we put so much money into localization, we expect the same growth. No, I mean, Are we putting all the same effort corporate wide on growing those markets? And if not, you need to make sure that the numbers are adjusted.
Yeah, because that links back to what you said before. Like, not everything is obviously directly correlated to localization, even though there is a correlation. Like, if you don't localize, you're not going to support those languages. It's definitely not going to go as well as when you have a localized experience.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I guess the first years are the hardest to estimate, because this is just a wild guess and say, okay, this is what we expect to happen. It could be better, it could be worse, but I think that after certain years in the localization program, you actually start seeing what's realistic and what's not, and how much effort or how much added effort into the localization program will pay off. Because as in any other program, more money doesn't mean necessarily more growth in that market. There will be a certain point in which that doesn't translate into more sustainable growth.
Yeah, it makes absolute sense. It's like a plateau after a while.
Yeah,
like you don't need to translate everything. That's another thing that sometimes might be a bit confusing. Like, you don't need to translate every single thing you have, because it might not make sense for their market.
exactly.
Like, I've seen it like translating documentation on features that are not even available in Denmark. So why would you're just wasting money there?
Yeah.
Maybe use it somewhere else.
I've seen it too. Yeah. So it's just like, let's translate for the sake of it. But yeah, I would be reluctant to do that. And it would be wiser to spend money on other areas of localization where you could create more impact.
And it's also like daunting, especially as you said, sometimes companies, let's say, get late they realize late that they need to localize, and they have a huge, let's say, a website or help center, and they look at it as like, oh, it's gonna cost like a lot of money to localize everything in 10 markets. Maybe they definitely don't need to do that, and especially not all at once, like not all in one go, all the pages.
Yeah.
Because it's daunting. So it's so big that then they never get to.
Yeah, and actually that kind of reminded me, and this happened very recently to me, where we started translating the help center articles for our new markets. One of the things that I was working on with the customer support team is, hey, we need to show with numbers how the translation of these articles is impacting the bandwidth of the customer support team, because we expect a reduced number of tickets, right? Now that we are translating these articles, people will not necessarily open a ticket or will not necessarily contact you on chat. They will go through that. So obviously, those are things that also need to be considered. It's not just about growth. It's also about customer satisfaction and customer retention. Obviously, if we see a reduction of support tickets in certain markets, that means that we are contributing somehow to that success. So it's just not all about growth. It's just about also making sure that the support is using their time more wisely, and we are able to reduce their bandwidth, right? That supporting users with problems.
Yeah, again, I like that you stress the fact that localization touches very different part of the experience, not just like getting new users, but then also supporting them throughout the life cycle. Yeah, absolutely. Like, when you have to launch a localization program within a SaaS startup, how would you establish a budget and resource plan? Like, what kind of advice would you give to somebody that has to look like how much resource we would have to put, in the sense that one of the questions that I get sometimes, like, can you give even like some specific example, like of a company starting out, how much they should spend? And I know it's very difficult. Like, you cannot just say, yeah, X amount, because it really changes case by case. So how would you what kind of advice would you give?
Sure. I mean, to me, it's clear that the first step should be about assessing scope and scale. So begin by defining the scope of your localization program. Which markets are you targeting? And how many languages are you going to be localizing into? Once you have defined that, what content needs localization? Is it just the software, or that is it also includes support or marketing or legal or help articles, as we were saying earlier? The scope will obviously influence your budget and the resources you're going to need to manage that budget. So once you have a clear idea on the scope, just break down the cost. And this includes, direct costs like translation services. This is how much we're going to spend on translation per se. And obviously, those costs will vary a lot depending on the language and the complexity of the content, right? So we know that some language pairs are more expensive than others. So obviously that's something that you also need to consider, right? We all know that, for instance, the Nordics are especially expensive compared to other European languages. And also the complexity, you don't pay the same for translating documentation that translating or transcreation for marketing, right? So these are all the different components that you need to put on paper and make your own calculation. And apart from these direct costs, you also need to consider indirect costs like, technology that you might use for managing the localization process. Another thing that you need to consider for putting the budget in place is making a decision about in-house or outsourcing your program, or maybe just create a hybrid mode, right? I have experience on both the scenarios in which we've started with in-house and gradually outsource some of the services and then incorporate them in-house when it did make sense, right? So it's a question of creating a good balance of, how much content for which language and making sure that outsourcing versus in-house and that you measure what's the impact of both models, right? Ongoing maintenance, obviously, things will not stay the same forever. So make sure that there might be a growing demand for content and that you don't create, let's say, a flat calculation for your program. There might be peaks and there may be downsizes of your program. So you need to make sure that incorporate those into your budget. Last but not least, probably I would create like a contingency fund at call it a percentage of the total calculation, just to make sure that you are able to cover for unexpected things. In my experience, they always happened. Either you have an additional language that you didn't account for, or you may have content types that were not initially in your scope of work for that year. And obviously, the worst thing that you may want to say to new stakeholders is mid-year is, hey, I don't have budget to support you, right? So if you are able to incorporate that kind of unexpected work in your budget, it will help you grow your awareness within the company, but also be perceived as a problem solver. Like, hey, this was not expected, but we are able to absorb this unexpected demand or unexpected language. And I think that as we have heard 1,000 times, come to me with solutions, not with problems. So if you are able to give an immediate solution to a problem that was not expected, the better for you and for the program.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I actually have a follow-up question on when you said take into account peaks and drops in demand. Like, can you give a little bit more into details of how to account for that? Because I like in my experience, usually people like then a clear number at the end of all the process. So how do you put that into like your calculation?
Yeah, well, especially on the software as a service environment, I'm not gonna say it's easy, but obviously if you have early conversations with your product managers and your product stakeholders, they will have kind of a clear vision on what the product roadmap for the upcoming months will be. Okay, so this is when we will be releasing new features, new functionalities. This is where we are expected to change things around, right? So that will give you a sense on what will be the content demand for you and your team and what you can expect during the remainder of the year. Sometimes there is no always a one-to-one correlation, but in most cases it will be, right? Maybe the demand for that content doesn't translate automatically into translation requirements, but that will give you a very good sense of, when these new features and functionalities will be available. And not just for product. You have to assume that whenever a new functionality is available, depending on how critical that is, there might be a marketing exercise associated with it. There might be a marketing campaign. You may have promotional videos. You have social media promotion. That will be a need for new help articles to answer the questions related to these new features. So all these things are need to be considered in the ups and downs. There is no always a huge demand for content. It will be always ups and downs. In the early stages of the program, it will be very hard to kind of predict those. But once you have become more mature, you will see what's the kind of the pace of the product teams, and that will give you a sense on when you can expect higher demand and lower demand.
And actually, about the blending itself, I was curious to understand a little bit better, like in your experience, do you have like some kind of calendar, like localization calendar that is synced up with the, let's say, product marketing support efforts? Or do you attend meetings in all of this along with these departments? How does it work in your experience? Or what you would recommend if somebody has to, let's say, set up a best practice?
Okay. I am fortunately involved in many conversations and roadmap meetings with the product team. So I want to believe that I have a clear vision of what's coming my way. We actually attend weekly meetings and we see what the product teams are working on, how much they have progressed, how close they are into the launch of those new functionalities, if there is something preventing them from launching on the agreed date. So I always kind of have a clear vision on what's happening behind my scenes. We actually have like 8, 9 different product teams, each of them working on different parts of the product. So I have a kind of a comprehensive view of what they are doing, most of them. And based on that, we create a roadmap for the translation program. This is when we are expecting things to happen, and this is when we are expecting things to be completed, right? So that also help us schedule things internally, so I can prepare my resources to make sure that whenever the content is ready for translation, all my resources are ready to create a very fast turnaround time so we can launch those new functionalities simultaneously across all our languages.
Okay. No, yeah, that's good to clarify, like not to be just reactive and waiting for requests to come in. Because especially when there's like unexpected requested, if they're unexpected, like with enough time in advance to prepare, it's good. If it's just we need it tomorrow and it's like something completely unexpected, like a new language or a completely different format that you haven't worked on before.
Yeah.
So I do get it. And do you think we're gonna wrap up on the topic? But before that, I wanted to ask you if there's anything that you think like we didn't touch upon, we didn't discuss regarding like how to get started with the localization program, specifically for software as a service. If you have any additional recommendation of something we haven't talked about.
Something that I always recommend is use your first days, weeks in your new company or in your new role, because there may be a new role and has been filled internally, is to talk to as many people as possible, right? Talk to your stakeholders, understand what their needs are, how they are doing things, because you will probably realize that there is a lot of room for improvement on how they are managing their processes and how that will impact your processes. Like, and again, this is from personal experience. You will not be surprised to see how many integrations are being not used just because no one is aware of those integrations, or just because not anyone in the company had the time to look into that. So understand the technology ecosystem of your teams and stakeholders. Make sure that you automate and use this integration as much as possible, because eventually it's going to be you managing the program. Extra help might come along the way, but initially it's just you. So the more you automate, the more integrations you create, the more you understand your stakeholder processes to fix things that there might be just, dropping fruit, and you are able to fix those things immediately, the better. So just talk, understand, and reiterate things that might be there for a long time and they are just being done because that's how things have always been done, but not because it's the best way of doing things.
Yeah, that's a really good advice. And again, I think I like that you're stressing the fact communicating with all the stakeholders involved, like not try to silo yourself in. Sometimes localization is a bit siloed in, but sometimes I think people might tend to silo themselves in, like afraid to reach out to different stakeholders. That's absolutely. And actually, I thought about an additional question. In your experience, how long does it take on average to get from when you get started to like start getting a sense of, because there's a lot of like preparation you do before you actually start translating things. How long does it take in your experience, more or less, from when you decide, okay, we need to start have the app localized, and then you actually start the actual translation? So all the strategy and setup we discussed, more or less, thinking of a startup at the very beginning.
Yeah. Well, it can be immediately, as it happened to me, but it can also be 3 months at least. I mean, if you're new to a company, and the company has been there for a long time, they can obviously survive without you for a few more months. So my recommendation is that at least you use the first weeks, months, to know the company culture, to know, as many people as needed. Because that will give you a very good overview of how things will work. Because if you start immediately, your expectations might be totally wrong, right? Maybe based on your experience in previous companies where things work totally different. And in this new company, the pace might be different, how people interact with each other and how teams interact with one another might be totally different. So you might think, hey, this should be done in 2 months' time. And you realize that things go quicker, but also might be going slower. But I think that at least 3 months, 2-3 months should be give you an idea of how things can get started, right? In my case, I have to tell you, it was immediate because there was already an ongoing process there, and it was just a question of streamlining and making things more standardized, because things were not being done in a pragmatic way, so to speak. But yeah, I think that should be kind of a realistic deadline or timeline.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I do completely understand that every company has a different setup, and especially in startup environments, not everything maybe is being thought out from the very beginning. It's more like a consequence of other choices, and so it does absolutely make sense. But it gives an idea, more or less, of like how it might be immediate if it's something already running. It might be immediate because it's immediately necessary, but it's best like to take a little bit of time. Yeah. So, Julio, thank you so much for joining us today at the Multilingual Content Podcast. And it was really interesting conversation. I would love to go more, but I don't think you really have the time today to extend further. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Nicola. It's been a pleasure having this conversation with you, and I really had a blast.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us today. The Multilingual Content Podcast is powered by Undertow. We help companies translate their content into results. Get in touch if you want to know more. And if you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new episode. See you next time.